The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a shroud as Marcus and Diane Romano stared at their son's empty tent. The nylon fabric flapped gently in the pre-dawn wind, the sleeping bag still zipped, his hiking boots lined up neatly by the entrance. 17-year-old Jake Romano had simply vanished into the vast wilderness of Yellowstone National Park sometime during the night of August 12, 2019. The Romanos had driven from Boise, Idaho, for what was supposed to be a week-long celebration before Jake's senior year. Their campsite near the Lamar Valley had seemed perfect, remote enough for solitude, accessible enough for safety. Marcus had checked on Jake around midnight when he'd gotten up for water. His son had been reading by flashlight, earbuds in, lost in a podcast about unsolved mysteries. It was the last time anyone would see him. If you're following this story, please subscribe to stay updated as we uncover what really happened in those dark woods, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything. By dawn, the park rangers had mobilized. They brought search dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers who combed through the lodgepole pine forests and sagebrush meadows. Jake's phone was found 50 yards from the campsite, face down in the dirt, battery dead. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. The ground was too hard and rocky to hold clear footprints. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Diane couldn't stop replaying their last conversation. Jake had been excited about starting his podcast series about America's national parks. He'd brought his expensive camera equipment, planning to shoot footage for a YouTube channel. He'd talked about wanting to capture the real Yellowstone, not just the tourist spots, but the liminal spaces where wildlife roamed and humans rarely ventured. The first week of searching yielded nothing. Search and rescue teams covered over 200 square miles. They dragged sections of the Lamar River, scaled cliff faces, and checked every cave system within a 10-mile radius. Jake's face appeared on news broadcasts across the mountain west. Tips flooded in. Someone thought they saw a teenager hitchhiking near Gardner. Another reported a young man matching his description at a gas station in Cody, Wyoming. Every lead dissolved into nothing. Marcus took a leave of absence from his job as an aerospace engineer. Diane, a high school art teacher, couldn't return to her classroom. Their lives became a blur of searches, press conferences, and endless waiting by phones that never rang with good news. Jake's younger sister, Emma, withdrew into herself, haunted by the brother-shaped absence in their home. As autumn turned Yellowstone's aspen groves to gold, the official search was scaled back. The Park Service gently suggested that Jake might have fallen into a thermal feature. Yellowstone's superheated pools and geysers had claimed lives before, leaving no trace. Marcus rejected this theory violently. Jake was cautious, respectful of nature's dangers. He wouldn't have wandered near the thermal areas at night. Winter came, brutal and unforgiving. The Romanos hired private investigators who found nothing the authorities hadn't already discovered. They contacted psychics, followed conspiracy theories, and joined online forums dedicated to missing persons in national parks. Some people whispered about predatory animals. Others suggested Jake had run away, though his bank accounts remained untouched, his social media frozen in time. The seasons cycled through. Spring returned, then summer again. The anniversary of Jake's disappearance passed like a stone dropping into a bottomless well. Diane had stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Marcus had developed a nervous habit of checking his phone obsessively, hoping for a message that would never come. Then, in July 2020, nearly a year after Jake vanished, Marcus received an unexpected package. It was Jake's camera, his prized possession, a professional-grade digital SLR that had been worth over $2,000. A hiker had found it wedged between rocks near Slough Creek, miles from their original campsite. The Park Service had held it as evidence before finally releasing it to the family. Marcus's hands trembled as he turned it over. The camera body was damaged, the lens cracked, but the memory card was intact. He rushed it to a data recovery specialist in Boise, hardly daring to hope. 3 days later, he sat in his home office, Diane beside him, as they watched the recovered footage. The first clips showed exactly what they expected. Jake documenting their trip. Sweeping vistas of the Lamar Valley at sunset, a bull elk bugling in the distance, Jake's own grinning face as he talked about the landscape's geological history. The timestamp showed these had been taken on August 11th, the day before he disappeared. Then came the night footage. The timestamp read 1:47 a.m., August 12th. The video was shaky, shot in near darkness. Jake's whispered voice came through. "I heard something outside. Probably just an animal, but I want to check." The camera captured glimpses of the tent interior, then the zipper being pulled down. The world outside was pitch black, the camera's night mode creating a grainy, greenish image. Jake was walking away from the campsite. His breathing was audible, quick and nervous. "There's definitely something out here," he whispered. "I can hear it moving." The camera swung wildly, catching fragments of trees, rocks, the star-filled sky. Then the footage cut out abruptly. Marcus played it again and again. There had to be something they were missing. Diane suggested they take it to the authorities, but Marcus had lost faith in official channels. Instead, he posted the raw footage on several missing persons forums, asking if anyone could enhance it or spot details they'd missed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Amateur sleuths downloaded the files, ran them through various filters, adjusted contrast and brightness. Dozens of people weighed in with theories, but it was a user named TechSleuthPDX who changed everything. TechSleuthPDX had access to an artificial intelligence program designed for video analysis, something originally developed for military applications but now available to tech-savvy civilians. The AI could process footage frame by frame, detecting patterns and objects that human eyes might miss. They offered to run Jake's video through the system. Marcus agreed immediately. 3 days later, TechSleuthPDX posted their findings. The AI had isolated and enhanced several frames from the final seconds before the video cut out. In the processed images, something became visible in the darkness behind Jake. A figure, partially obscured by trees, but unmistakably human in shape. The figure appeared to be crouching, watching. It wasn't moving toward Jake, just observing from approximately 30 feet away. The AI analysis indicated the figure was likely male, based on body proportions and wearing dark clothing. But the most disturbing detail was what the enhanced processing revealed about the timeline. The figure had been there from the moment Jake left the tent, following him silently through the trees. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. His son hadn't wandered off into the wilderness by accident. Someone had been out there, waiting in the darkness. Someone had lured or followed Jake away from safety. The disappearance wasn't a tragic accident or a case of a teenager making a fatal mistake. It was something far worse. He immediately contacted the FBI. This time, the case was taken seriously. The enhanced footage was examined by federal analysts who confirmed what the AI had found. An official investigation was reopened, now treating Jake's disappearance as a potential abduction. The media seized on the story. AI solves National Park mystery, read one headline. Others were more sensational. Digital detective reveals hidden predator in Yellowstone case. In these, the Romano family was thrust back into the spotlight. They'd tried so hard to escape. FBI agents descended on Yellowstone, re-interviewing everyone who'd been in the park that August. They pulled records of registered campers, cross-referenced them with criminal databases, and brought in specialized units trained in wilderness abduction cases. The figure in the footage became the focus of an intense manhunt. But identifying someone from grainy, enhanced video footage proved nearly impossible. The FBI released the images to the public, asking for help. Tips flooded in. People reported similar figures seen in other parks, suspicious individuals camping alone in remote areas, vehicles noticed near the Lamar Valley around the time of Jake's disappearance. One tip stood out. A former park employee named Gerald Westbrook contacted the FBI with information. He'd worked in Yellowstone's maintenance department for 15 years before being quietly let go in 2018 for what the Park Service called conduct unbecoming. Westbrook claimed he knew of several unauthorized campsites deep in the backcountry, places where someone could hide for months without detection. Westbrook described a particular spot near Slough Creek, accessible only by an old game trail that didn't appear on any official maps. He'd discovered it years ago while searching for a lost hiker. The location was less than 3 miles from where Jake's camera had been found. It was remote enough that even experienced rangers rarely ventured there. The FBI organized an expedition to the site in late August 2020. Marcus insisted on joining them against the agent's advice. They hiked for hours through dense forest, following Westbrook's directions. The air was thin and cold, even in summer. Marcus's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. They found the camp exactly where Westbrook had described. Someone had been living there, a crude shelter made from branches and a salvaged tarp, a fire pit ringed with stones, and most damning, personal items that clearly didn't belong to a single person. There were clothes in different sizes, a collection of driver's licenses and ID cards, and photographs. Dozens of photographs of young people in various national parks, taken from a distance without their knowledge. But the camp was abandoned. Whoever had been there had left recently, perhaps tipped off by the media coverage. The FBI collected everything as evidence, cataloguing each item with grim efficiency. Among the belongings, they found a wallet. The ID inside belonged to Kevin Mathers, a 23-year-old from Helena, Montana, who'd been reported missing from Glacier National Park in 2017. The case exploded into a multi-state investigation. The FBI connected the camp to at least 6 disappearances across different western parks over a span of 8 years. The pattern was chilling. All young people, all vanished without a trace from remote campsites, all during late-night hours. The perpetrator had been moving between parks, hunting vulnerable victims in America's most beautiful and isolated wilderness areas. DNA evidence from the camp was run through every database. They got a hit, partial matches to evidence from 2 unsolved break-ins at ranger stations in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, where camping permits and park maps had been stolen. But they still didn't have a name or face. Marcus threw himself into the investigation with obsessive intensity. He created a detailed timeline of every disappearance, mapping the locations, weather conditions, and park events happening at the time. He noticed that the disappearances clustered around periods of high tourist traffic, times when one more tent in the backcountry wouldn't draw attention. Diane, meanwhile, had found Jake's journal in his belongings, something they'd overlooked in the initial chaos. In the entries from their Yellowstone trip, Jake had written about feeling watched during a hike on August 11th. He'd dismissed it as paranoia, the result of listening to too many scary podcasts. But he'd described seeing a guy in weird, dark clothes near the Lamar River, someone who'd been standing very still, just watching the trail. This detail proved crucial. The FBI cross-referenced it with visitor logs and permit applications. They found a name that appeared in park records across multiple locations and dates that coincided with several disappearances. Thomas Vance, a 42-year-old former wildlife biologist who'd lost his position with the National Park Service in 2011 after accusations of inappropriate behavior toward younger colleagues. Vance had essentially vanished from normal society after his dismissal, living off the grid and moving between national forests and parks. He had wilderness survival skills, knew the park systems intimately, and harbored a deep resentment toward the institution that had rejected him. Psychological profiles suggested he'd transferred that resentment onto young visitors who represented everything he felt he'd lost: youth, promise, acceptance. The manhunt intensified. Vance's photograph was distributed to every park ranger and law enforcement agency in the western United States. He became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. But the wilderness was vast, and Vance knew it better than almost anyone. Weeks passed with no sightings. Marcus couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The knowledge that someone had taken his son, that Jake might have suffered, was unbearable. Yet not knowing Jake's fate was somehow worse. He oscillated between fury and crushing despair. Then, in October 2020, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A wildlife camera maintained by conservation researchers captured footage of a man matching Vance's description in the remote thoroughfare region of Yellowstone, one of the most isolated areas in the lower 48 states. The FBI mobilized immediately, coordinating with park rangers and bringing in tracking specialists. The operation was launched in near-total secrecy to avoid spooking their target. Helicopters deployed teams at strategic points, effectively creating a net around the thoroughfare area. Search dogs picked up a scent trail leading to a series of caves near the upper Yellowstone River. On October 19, 2020, FBI agents surrounded the caves at dawn. They called for Vance to surrender. The silence stretched for minutes that felt like hours. Then a figure emerged from the darkness, gaunt, bearded, wearing clothes that had disintegrated into rags. It was Thomas Vance. He surrendered without resistance, almost relieved to be caught. In custody, he was eerily calm, speaking in a detached monotone about his mission to protect the parks from those who didn't respect them. In his twisted logic, he'd appointed himself as a guardian of the wilderness, punishing those he deemed unworthy. The interrogations revealed a horrifying truth. Vance confessed to abducting 9 young people over the years. He'd kept detailed records in notebooks hidden throughout various park locations, but when agents asked about Jake Romano specifically, Vance fell silent. "Where is he?" Marcus demanded when he was finally allowed to speak to Vance through video conference. "What did you do to my son?" Vance looked at the camera with empty eyes. "The park keeps its secrets," he said cryptically. "Some things return to the earth." The answer was maddeningly vague, but FBI analysts interpreted it to mean that Vance had killed his victims and hidden their remains in remote locations throughout the parks. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were deployed to sites Vance had frequented. The search was painstaking and often heartbreaking. In December 2020, search teams working near Mirror Plateau, one of Yellowstone's most remote areas, found human remains in a concealed ravine. DNA testing confirmed what Marcus had already known in his heart but couldn't accept. The remains belonged to Jake Romano. The medical examiner's report indicated Jake had died from blunt force trauma shortly after his abduction. He hadn't suffered long, a small mercy in an ocean of grief. Marcus and Diane were able to bring their son home, to lay him to rest in Boise beside his grandparents. The closure they desperately needed came at an unbearable cost. The Romano family held a memorial service on a crisp January day in 2021. Hundreds attended, friends, family, members of the search teams who'd never stopped looking, and strangers who'd followed Jake's story and felt connected to his fate. Emma, now 16, spoke about her brother with a strength that amazed everyone present. She talked about his curiosity, his kindness, his dreams of showing people the beauty of America's wild places. "Jake would want his story to mean something," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He would want other families to be protected, for people to understand the risks, to look out for each other." Thomas Vance faced trial in federal court in the summer of 2021. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Beyond his confession, investigators had recovered physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including 9 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, Marcus was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. He stood before the court, looking directly at Vance, and spoke not with the rage everyone expected, but with devastating clarity. "You didn't just take my son's life," Marcus said. "You took his future, his dreams, his chance to become who he was meant to be. You took our family's happiness, our sense of safety in the world. You created a hole that will never be filled, but you didn't win. Jake's memory will outlive you. The good he brought to the world will echo long after you're forgotten." Vance received 9 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security federal prison in Colorado, where he would spend the rest of his days far from the wilderness he'd claimed to protect. The case led to significant changes in how national parks handle visitor safety. The Park Service implemented new protocols for monitoring remote campsites, increased ranger patrols in backcountry areas, and developed better systems for tracking missing persons cases. Several parks installed additional emergency communication equipment in previously isolated zones. Marcus and Diane established the Jake Romano Foundation, dedicated to wilderness safety education and supporting families of missing persons. They worked with technology companies to make AI-assisted video analysis tools available to law enforcement agencies investigating disappearances. The software that had revealed the figure lurking in Jake's footage was refined and deployed across multiple jurisdictions. Emma graduated high school with honors and chose to study forensic science in college. She wanted to help other families find answers, to be the voice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. On her application essays, she wrote about her brother and how his disappearance had shown her that even in tragedy, there could be purpose. The Romano family returned to Yellowstone only once, in the summer of 2023. They hiked to a spot Jake had loved, a meadow where he'd filmed elk grazing at sunset. They scattered wildflower seeds there, creating a small memorial that would bloom each spring. Marcus stood in that high mountain meadow, breathing the thin air, watching clouds cast shadows on distant peaks, and finally allowed himself to cry. Not just from grief, but from gratitude that Jake had been found, that other families had been spared, that evil had been brought to light. Diane placed a small plaque among the rocks, simple words etched in bronze. Jake Romano, explorer of wild places, forever 17. The wilderness had taken their son, but it had also revealed him. The AI that had processed those dark frames of video had given them truth when human eyes could not see. Technology and determination had pierced the mystery, exposing the monster hiding in America's most beautiful spaces. Years would pass, and the pain would never completely fade. But the Romanos learned to carry it, to transform it into something that honored Jake's memory. They spoke at conferences about missing persons, they lobbied for better funding for search and rescue operations, and they supported other families navigating the nightmare they'd endured. On quiet nights, Marcus sometimes watched the enhanced footage again, not the horrifying frames showing the hidden figure, but the earlier clips of Jake laughing, exploring, reveling in the natural world he loved. Those moments became precious beyond measure, proof that Jake had lived fully in his 17 years, that he'd experienced joy and wonder and connection. The story of Jake Romano's disappearance became a case study in criminal justice programs, a cautionary tale told to park visitors, and a testament to the power of technology used for good. The AI analysis that had cracked the case inspired other investigations, leading to breakthroughs in cold cases across the country. What had begun as a family's worst nightmare had become a tool for justice, helping to bring closure to others lost in the shadows. In the end, the wilderness kept many secrets, but not Jake's. The hidden figure had been exposed, the truth revealed, and a son brought home. It was the smallest of victories against the vast indifference of nature and the cruelty of human evil, but for the Romano family, it was everything. They had their answer. They had their boy. And they had ensured that his brief, bright life had mattered in ways that would ripple forward through time, protecting strangers he would never meet, in wild places he would have loved to explore. The years that followed brought unexpected connections. In March 2024, Marcus received an email from Dr. Patricia Huang, a computational forensics researcher at the University of Washington. She'd been studying the AI analysis methods used in Jake's case and had refined the technology even further. Her team had developed algorithms that could detect subtle movement patterns and identify individuals from partial biometric data in low-quality footage. "Your son's case changed everything," Dr. Huang wrote. "The techniques we developed based on that investigation have helped solve 14 cold cases in the past 2 years. I wanted you to know that Jake's story continues to save lives and bring answers to families still searching." Marcus shared the email with Diane and Emma over dinner that night. They sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of it. 14 families who now had closure, who could move forward with their grief instead of being trapped in uncertainty. It didn't bring Jake back, but it gave his death a meaning that transcended their personal loss. Emma was now in her junior year at the University of Montana, majoring in forensic science with a minor in computer science. She'd spent the previous summer interning with the FBI's evidence response team, learning the meticulous work of crime scene investigation. Her professors said she had an exceptional eye for detail and an unwavering commitment to finding truth in the smallest fragments of evidence. She often thought about the night Jake disappeared, about the what-ifs that haunted every survivor of tragedy. What if she'd been on that camping trip? What if she'd woken up when Jake left the tent? What if she could have screamed, alerted their parents, changed the trajectory of that terrible night? Therapy had helped her understand that these questions led nowhere productive, but they still surfaced in quiet moments. The Jake Romano Foundation had grown beyond anything Marcus and Diane had initially envisioned. What started as a small organization focused on wilderness safety had evolved into a comprehensive resource for families of missing persons. They'd partnered with the National Park Service to create a rapid response protocol that activated within hours of a disappearance report, dramatically improving recovery rates. They'd also funded the installation of emergency communication towers in remote areas of several western parks, creating a network that allowed hikers to call for help even in previously dead zones. The first life saved by this system was a diabetic woman who'd become disoriented on a trail in Grand Teton. She'd used one of the emergency phones to reach rangers before her condition became critical. When Marcus heard about it, he wept with gratitude that something good had emerged from the darkness. In the autumn of 2024, the Foundation sponsored a conference on missing persons cases in wilderness areas, bringing together law enforcement, park rangers, search and rescue professionals, and family advocates. Marcus delivered the opening keynote, his voice strong and clear as he addressed the assembled crowd. "We cannot eliminate risk from wild places," he said. "Nature is inherently dangerous, and that danger is part of what makes wilderness precious. But we can be smarter, more prepared, and more responsive when tragedy strikes. We can use technology not to tame the wilderness, but to protect those who venture into it with respect and wonder." The conference revealed disturbing statistics. Over 600 people go missing in national parks each year, most found alive within 72 hours. but approximately 15% remain unaccounted for. These cases often grow cold quickly, with limited resources and vast search areas making recovery unlikely. The conference participants worked together to develop new strategies for handling these cases, drawing lessons from Jake's investigation and others like it. One session focused specifically on the role of artificial intelligence in solving cold cases. Tech sleuth Poppy DX, whose real name was revealed to be David Chen, a software engineer from Portland, presented the video analysis techniques he'd used on Jake's footage. He'd since founded a non-profit called Digital Justice Initiative, offering pro bono AI analysis services to families who couldn't afford private investigators. Marcus met David in person for the first time during the conference. They embraced like old friends, though they'd only communicated online before. David was younger than Marcus had imagined, barely 30, with an earnest intensity that reminded Marcus painfully of Jake. "I think about your son every time I work on a case," David said quietly. "I wonder if he'd have gone into tech, if he'd have been doing this kind of work. The world lost someone special." "He would have liked you," Marcus replied. "He would have been fascinated by what you do." During the conference, several families approached Marcus and Diane to share their own stories. A couple from Nevada, whose daughter had vanished in Death Valley 3 years earlier. A father from Oregon, whose son had disappeared while rock climbing in Smith Rock State Park. A woman whose brother had gone missing during a solo backpacking trip in the Wind River Range. Each story was unique, yet they all shared the same terrible uncertainty, the same desperate need for answers. Diane found herself becoming a counselor to these families, drawing on her own experience to offer comfort and practical advice. She helped them navigate the bureaucratic challenges of missing persons investigations, connected them with resources, and simply listened when they needed someone who truly understood. It was exhausting work, reopening her own wounds repeatedly, but she felt called to it. "Jake would want us to help," she told Marcus one night, after a particularly emotional conversation with a mother whose teenage son had vanished in Yosemite. "He was always the kid who stood up for others, who couldn't walk past someone in pain without stopping. This is how we honor that." The foundation also worked with content creators and educators to develop wilderness safety curricula for schools. They created engaging videos and interactive modules, teaching young people how to prepare for outdoor adventures, recognize dangerous situations, and respond to emergencies. The materials emphasized not fear, but informed respect for wild spaces. Emma contributed to these efforts, helping design content that would resonate with her generation. She understood that teenagers responded better to authentic storytelling than lectures. The foundation produced a documentary about Jake's life, his passion for nature, and the circumstances of his disappearance. It was honest about the dangers while celebrating the joy Jake had found in exploration. The documentary premiered at several film festivals in early 2025, winning awards for its sensitive handling of difficult subject matter. Viewers wrote to the foundation describing how the film had changed their approach to outdoor recreation, making them more aware of risks without diminishing their love of wild places. Schools began using it as an educational tool, sparking discussions about safety, awareness, and the importance of looking out for one another. Thomas Vance, meanwhile, faded into obscurity within the prison system. Appeals of his conviction were routinely denied. He gave no interviews, wrote no manifestos, and seemed content to disappear into the anonymity of incarceration. Marcus considered this a small victory, denying Vance the notoriety that some criminals craved. Jake would be remembered. His killer would be forgotten. In May 2025, on what would have been Jake's 23rd birthday, the family gathered at the meadow in Yellowstone, where they'd scattered wildflower seeds. The memorial had flourished beyond their expectations. Lupines and Indian paintbrush bloomed in vibrant purples and reds, attracting butterflies and hummingbirds. It felt alive in a way that brought comfort rather than pain. Emma had brought her boyfriend, Alex, a fellow forensic science student who'd heard countless stories about the brother he'd never meet. Marcus watched his daughter kneeling among the flowers, her hand resting on the memorial plaque, whispering words meant only for Jake. She'd grown into a remarkable young woman, strong, compassionate, driven by purpose. Jake would have been proud of her. "Do you think he knows?" Diane asked Marcus as they stood watching Emma. "Do you think he knows what his story became? How many people it helped?" Marcus didn't believe in easy answers about what came after death, but he chose to believe in this moment. "I think he knows we never gave up," he said. "I think he knows he mattered." They spent the afternoon hiking the same trails Jake had explored on his last day. The landscape was unchanged, the same sweeping valleys, the same distant peaks wearing caps of snow, even in late spring, the same herds of bison grazing in meadows that had seen a million sunsets. Nature's indifference had once felt cruel to Marcus, but he'd come to understand it differently. The wilderness didn't care about human tragedy, but it also didn't diminish it. Jake's brief presence in these mountains had been real, significant, and irreplaceable. That evening they joined a gathering organized by the Foundation, families of the missing and the found, coming together to share memories and support. The event had become an annual tradition, held each year on Jake's birthday. There was food and music, tears and laughter, and the powerful sense that none of them were alone in their grief. A woman named Carol Martinez spoke about her son, David, who'd been one of Vance's victims, missing from Rocky Mountain National Park in 2015. His remains had been recovered during the investigation following Vance's arrest. "We lived in hell for 5 years, Carol said, her voice breaking. Not knowing was worse than the worst truth. What the Romanos did, the foundation they built, it helped us navigate that hell. It gave us hope when we had none." Marcus listened to story after story, each one a testament to resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. These families had been shattered, but they'd found ways to reassemble themselves into new configurations, carrying their grief while still finding reasons to wake up each morning, to laugh, to love, to continue. The Foundation announced a new initiative that evening, a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in search and rescue, criminal investigation, or forensic science. The Jake Romano Memorial Scholarship would fund 4 years of education for deserving students who demonstrated both academic excellence and a commitment to helping others. Emma would be on the selection committee, bringing insight into what her brother would have valued in candidates. Jake loved learning, Marcus said in his remarks. He was curious about everything: geology, ecology, history, technology. He would have made an incredible scientist or educator. These scholarships will help young people pursue the kinds of careers he might have chosen, doing work that makes the world safer and better understood. The first scholarship recipients would be announced in the fall. Applications had already started arriving, each one telling the story of a young person inspired to make a difference. Reading them, Marcus was struck by how many applicants mentioned Jake's case specifically as their motivation for entering the field. His son had become a symbol, an inspiration to strangers who'd never known him but felt connected to his story. As summer progressed, Emma began working on her senior thesis, a comprehensive analysis of how technological advances had transformed missing persons investigations over the past decade. She interviewed David Chen, Dr. Huang, and dozens of law enforcement professionals who'd adopted AI-assisted analysis techniques. The work was demanding but deeply meaningful, connecting her personal experience with broader questions about justice and innovation. She also spent time with families who were still searching, offering practical assistance with social media campaigns, helping organize volunteer searches and providing emotional support born from genuine understanding. More than once, Marcus watched his daughter comfort a grieving parent and saw in her gestures echoes of Diane's compassion and his own determination. Jake's absence had shaped who Emma was becoming, forging strength from suffering. In August 2025, the 6th anniversary of Jake's disappearance, the family chose not to focus on that terrible date, but rather to celebrate his life. They organized a community event in Boise, a nature photography exhibition featuring Jake's work alongside images from other young photographers. The exhibition aimed to showcase the beauty that had captivated Jake, the wild places he'd loved, and the artistic vision he'd been developing. Over 300 people attended the opening. Jake's photographs lined the gallery walls, golden aspens reflecting in still water, a fox-kit peering from tall grass, storm clouds gathering over mountain peaks. Each image captured a moment of perfect attention, Jake's ability to see beauty in quiet details. Visitors moved slowly through the space, reading the brief descriptions Emma had written for each piece. One photo in particular drew crowds. It showed the Lamar Valley at sunset, taken the evening before Jake disappeared. The light was extraordinary, long shadows stretching across sage-covered hills, the river gleaming like molten gold, mountains silhouetted against a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. It was the last photograph Jake had taken before everything changed. Diane stood before it for a long time, remembering that evening. They'd cooked dinner over a camp stove, laughing as Marcus struggled with the temperamental burner. Jake had run to catch the sunset light, returning breathless and excited to show them what he'd captured. "Look at this," he'd said, his face glowing. "This is why we come to places like this. This is what makes everything worth it." The exhibition ran for 3 weeks, and thousands of people came to see it. Local media covered it extensively, revisiting Jake's story, but focusing on his talents and passions rather than just the tragedy of his death. Several of his photographs sold, with proceeds going to the foundation. The buyers weren't collectors seeking investment pieces. They were people who'd been touched by Jake's story and wanted to own a small piece of his vision. As autumn arrived, Emma began her final year of college. She'd been accepted into graduate programs at several prestigious universities, each offering to fund her research into forensic technology applications. She chose to stay at the University of Montana, wanting to work with professors who specialized in wildlife forensics and had connections to the national parks where her brother had disappeared. Her research proposal focused on developing portable AI analysis systems that could be deployed during active searches, processing video footage from drones and trail cameras in real time. If such technology had existed in 2019, Jake might have been found within hours instead of years. Emma was determined to build that future for others. Marcus had returned to work at the aerospace firm, finding solace in the precise demands of engineering. His colleagues had been remarkably supportive during the darkest years, and he appreciated the normalcy of focusing on technical problems with clear solutions. But his heart remained committed to the foundation, and he devoted evenings and weekends to its growing operations. Diane had also returned to teaching, finding purpose in shaping young minds and fostering creativity. Her students knew about Jake. She spoke of him openly, sharing both the joy he'd brought to their family and the importance of cherishing every moment with loved ones. She encouraged her art students to explore themes of loss and memory, helping them process their own griefs through creative expression. The Romano family had been fundamentally changed by Jake's disappearance and death, reshaped by trauma into something they'd never chosen to become. But within that transformation, they discovered strength they hadn't known they possessed, compassion that expanded to embrace strangers, and a commitment to turning personal tragedy into collective benefit. Jake's room remained largely unchanged in their home, a space frozen in time that they visited when they needed to feel close to him. His books lined the shelves, his camera equipment carefully preserved, his unfinished projects waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. It was both shrine and memorial, painful and comforting in equal measure. On quiet evenings, Marcus sometimes sat in that room, holding objects Jake had touched, a favorite rock from a childhood camping trip, a worn paperback about Yellowstone's history, a USB drive containing hundreds of photographs. He'd put on music Jake had loved and simply exist in the space his son had occupied, remembering. Diane would find him there sometimes and sit beside him without speaking, her head on his shoulder, both of them wrapped in memories of a boy who'd loved fiercely, explored fearlessly, and left the world far too soon. They'd learned that grief never really ended. It just evolved, becoming something you carried rather than something that carried you away. Emma visited less frequently, finding the room too painful most days, but on particularly difficult nights, when the weight of studying death and violence in her coursework became overwhelming, she'd curl up in Jake's old beanbag chair and read his journals, letting his words remind her why the work mattered. The foundation continued to grow, expanding its reach and impact. By late 2025, they'd helped coordinate searches for over 40 missing persons, provided financial assistance to dozens of families, funded technological improvements in 6 national parks, and educated thousands of people about wilderness safety. The organization that had been born from tragedy had become a force for meaningful change. News outlets occasionally checked in with the Romanos, doing anniversary pieces or updates on the Foundation's work. Marcus had become comfortable with these interviews, using them as opportunities to keep missing persons issues in the public consciousness. He'd learned that visibility mattered, that keeping these stories alive could prompt tips, inspire policy changes, and encourage funding for search operations. In one interview, a reporter asked if he'd ever forgive Thomas Vance. Marcus paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Forgiveness isn't really the point," he said. "Vance will spend the rest of his life in prison. That's justice. What matters to me is making sure what he did has consequences beyond his own punishment. If Jake's death leads to systems that protect others, if our grief becomes purpose that prevents future tragedies, then we've taken something evil and transformed it. That's more important than forgiveness." The winter of 2025 brought heavy snows to the mountain west, blanketing Yellowstone in white silence. The park closed many roads, and visitor numbers dropped to a trickle. It was the season Jake had always wanted to see, the wildlife visible against snow, the thermal features creating dramatic steam columns in frozen air, the landscape transformed into something primordial and pristine. Marcus and Diane had planned to visit Yellowstone that December to see the winter Jake had dreamed about. But when the time came, they couldn't quite bring themselves to make the trip. The park held too many ghosts, too many memories of what might have been. Perhaps next year, they told each other. Perhaps eventually the pain would soften enough that they could return to that place and find peace. Instead, they spent the holidays quietly at home with Emma and Alex, creating new traditions that honored Jake's memory without being consumed by it. They cooked his favorite foods, looked through photo albums, and told stories that made them laugh and cry. They acknowledged the emptiness where he should have been, while also celebrating the family they still had. On Christmas morning, Emma gave her parents a gift that left them speechless. She'd worked with a composer to create a piece of music inspired by Jake's photographs, translating visual beauty into sound. The composition incorporated recordings from Yellowstone, wind through pines, the bugle of elk, the gurgle of thermal features, woven together with strings and piano into something achingly beautiful. They listened together in the living room, tears streaming down their faces as music evoked the brother and son they'd lost. It was grief and love made audible, a reminder that Jake's spirit lived on in art, in memory, in the countless ways his brief life continued to touch the world. As the year drew to a close, Marcus reflected on everything that had changed since that terrible August night 6 years earlier. They'd descended into darkness, believing they'd never find light again. But slowly, painfully, they'd built something from the ruins of their happiness, not a replacement for what they'd lost. Nothing could ever replace Jake, but a different kind of purpose, a reason to continue. The foundation would keep growing. Emma would graduate and begin her career helping others. The scholarship recipients would go into the world doing work Jake would have admired. Technology would continue improving, making wilderness safer without diminishing its wonder. And somewhere in Yellowstone, wildflowers would bloom each spring in a meadow where a boy who loved the wild places was remembered. Jake Romano's story didn't have a happy ending, but it had meaning, impact, and a legacy that extended far beyond the tragedy of his death. In a world that often felt random and cruel, his family had found a way to impose order on chaos, to extract purpose from pain. They'd turned their worst nightmare into a tool for helping others, ensuring that Jake's name would always be associated not just with loss, but with hope, change, and the enduring power of love to transform even the darkest experiences into something that served the light.